Welcome to CTV News Trendline with Michael Stittle and Nik Nanos.
Nik, the federal election is in full swing. We're seeing a resurgence in Liberal support. We're going to dig down into the numbers across the country. But first, what is the national ballot tracking like?
The latest CTV News Globe and Mail Nanos tracking completed last night has the Liberals at 45% nationally, the Conservatives at 37%, NDP 10%, Bloc 6%, Green Party 2%, People's Party 1%. You know what, Michael? The Liberals have been picking up like a percentage point a day for the first part of the campaign. And, go figure, they've got an 8-point advantage right now over the Conservatives.
That's amazing. I see on the board that the People's Party of Canada and the Green Party are nearly in a statistical tie now.
Actually, what's interesting, if you remember, when the Conservatives were way ahead, like 47, and the Liberals were at 20, the first part of the Liberal comeback, at least, were former Liberals that were angry with the Liberals, disappointed with Justin Trudeau, kind of fed up, opting for Pierre Poilievre. Those were the first to come back to the Liberals. But what we've seen, at least in the last 10 days, is the Carney Liberals squeezing the New Democrats, squeezing the Bloc in Quebec, squeezing the Greens, and those voters swinging over to the Liberals. And you know what? If Jagmeet Singh and the NDP don't do better, it'll just be bad news and a difficult election for Pierre Poilievre and the federal Conservatives.
And Nik, the NDP, it seems sort of below what I would assume to be their core support.
Oh yeah, it's probably a low that we haven't seen in probably more than a decade. We have to remember the New Democrats formed the opposition under Jack Layton and were the opposition under Tom Mulcair. So for the New Democrats to be at 10% means that they could even lose, if this trend continues, they could lose their party status. It's really bad news. They're going to have to engage themselves. But we're having an election right now, Michael, where voters are clearly focused on the Liberals and the Conservatives. And to put this into context, so think 45-37, that means that more than 8 out of every 10, 82% of Canadians are voting for the two front-running parties. To put that into context, in the last couple of elections, it was usually like 66, 67, 68% of Canadians that were voting for the two main parties. The other parties, all of them, the New Democrats, Greens, Bloc, and so forth, even the People's Party, were doing much better. So it's kind of like a consolidation of the political menu to two choices that people are really focused on today.
And Nik, you've got a regional breakdown for ballot tracking. Let's start in the East Coast. What are you seeing in the Atlantic region?
Massive surge for the Liberals in the Atlantic region. At one point at the end of December, the Conservatives were leading, but now we have the Liberals, way ahead at around, they about 6 out of every 10 individuals in Atlantic Canada would vote Liberal. The Conservatives are back in the 30s. The New Democrats are nowhere. If these numbers hold up, the Liberals will be able to hold and actually mount a major challenge to the Conservatives in Atlantic Canada.
In Quebec, it looks like the Bloc has taken a real hit, I guess, with the emergence of Donald Trump as a central issue in this election.
Massive drop for the Bloc in the last couple of weeks in the province of Quebec. We have the Liberals in the high 40s in the province of Quebec, and then basically the Bloc, and then the Conservatives in the low 20s. NDP are not really anywhere around 5%. Maybe, Michael, one way to think about Quebec is that, yes, Quebecers, a significant number of Quebecers are nationalistic. They're proud. They want to protect the French language. But Canada is at risk right now. And even though they might like Blanchette, the leader of the Bloc Québécois, the thing is that they're now thinking about who can best lead Canada. And right now, it looks like they're much more likely to favor Mark Carney, which speaks to why the Liberals have and are really doing well in the province of Quebec in the last 3 weeks.
Now, how about Ontario?
Ontario was almost a lock for the Conservatives at the end of 2024, and it was a bit of a tie leading into the beginning of the election between the Conservatives and the Liberals. But fast forward now, after the last 8 or 9 days, what we see are the Liberals pulling ahead. They're in the high 40s with the Conservatives in the high 30s. So the Conservatives are about 10 points back, NDP at around 10. But, now we're back into the world, which maybe it's a little more traditional, where Toronto has been in the past a Liberal fortress, now is becoming a Liberal fortress again today. And even ridings like St. Paul's, which was like the canary in the coal mine that the Conservatives won when people were really angry with the Liberals and Justin Trudeau. Even St. Paul's is now a bit of a toss-up coming off of their big by-election, the Conservative big by-election there. So, Ontario swinging to the Liberals.
Any surprises in the prairies?
Well, the Prairies represents the one piece of good news for the Conservatives. We have the Conservatives in the mid-50s, and the Liberals basically 30 points back. NDP at around 15 or thereabouts in the Prairie provinces, but the Conservatives remain rock solid in the Prairie provinces. Liberals might pick up or do okay in a couple seats in Edmonton and stuff like that, but beyond that, it's basically Tory blue all the way through when it comes to the Prairie provinces.
And finally, Nik, British Columbia.
British Columbia is going to be a fascinating race. I think we'll probably be staying up late, Michael, me and you, watching the seats pan out in British Columbia. We have a dead heat between the Liberals and the Conservatives within the margin of error, both in the low 40s in British Columbia. The NDP are back 25 points at around 15%. Bad news for Jagmeet Singh and the New Democrats in BC. Even the Green Party is not doing well in the province of British Columbia, as British Columbians also become fixated on the Conservatives and the Liberals as the two front runners. We've got the Greens at 2%. They're at 2% nationally, and they're at 2% in BC. And if BC doesn't vote Green, it's just hard for the Greens to do well in an election right now.
Nik, I want to talk about the campaign trail. We've seen a couple issues so far with the Liberals and Conservatives. I want to start with Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. There's been some public hand-wringing, some questions around the direction of strategist Jenny Byrne. A reporter asked him that the other day, and I want to play his response.
There are reports on mounting frustrations about how the campaign is going and the trailing polling numbers. What's your plan to turn things around, and will you make changes to the campaign leadership?
Some people have said that I should stop talking about the doubling housing costs that have denied an entire generation the chance to own a home after the lost Liberal decade. They say that we shouldn't be debating why single moms are lined up at food banks in record numbers after the lost Liberal decade. They suggest that we shouldn't debate why 50,000 of our citizens have lost their lives to drug overdoses under the radical Liberal drug policies. That we should just forget that after the lost Liberal decade of rising costs and crime and a falling economy under America's thumb, that we should just ignore all of those things. I disagree. My purpose in politics is to restore Canada's promise so that anyone from anywhere can achieve anything. It's hard work gets you a great life and a beautiful, affordable home on a safe street, protected by brave troops under a proud flag. All the things that we need to do to respond to the economic aggression of the Americans are things I've been talking about for 10 years. I was standing up for pipelines 10 years ago when Mark Carney was opposing them. I've been saying that we need to approve resource projects quickly for the last 10 years while Mark Carney was supporting C-69 and the energy cap and other Liberal policies. I've stood up for tax cuts that will unleash growth in our economy over the last 10 years, in fact, over my entire career. The threats, the unjustified threats by President Trump further strengthen the argument in favor of the Canada First agenda that I've been fighting for my whole life. And while we propose those solutions, we will not forget the single mom who can't afford food. We will not forget the seniors who are choosing between eating and heating. We will not forget that young 36-year-old couple whose biological clock is running out faster than they can afford to buy a home and have kids. We will not forget the families terrorized by crime and drugs. And so we will continue, despite calls to the contrary, to talk about those things, even if I am the only leader in the country that offers any change. And the choice, again, is whether, after this lost Liberal decade of rising costs and crime, with our economy falling under the American thumb, do we give them, can we afford to give them a fourth term? Or is it time to put Canada first for a change with a new Conservative government that will restore Canada's promise?
Nik, so he's really hammering those core messaging that he had such success over with in 2024, cost of living issues, essentially. What do you make of this?
Well, we have to remember, Michael, at 37%, that's usually enough support. That's where the Conservatives are. That's enough support to win an election. Like Stephen Harper formed governments, a series of governments, with basically 36, 37% of the vote. You know, and we have to recognize the Liberals, people have not forgotten the last 10 years. People are still grumpy and people are still worried about paying for the bills. But maybe one thing to think about it is that right now, with Pierre Poilievre focusing mostly on the cost of living in the last 10 years, it's kind of like he's a one-punch wonder. It's kind of like punching. It's a good punch, just one-punch wonder. He really, I don't think he needs to tack, but I think he needs to add a second punch. The second punch being Trump and also Pierre Poilievre's vision for the future in terms of where jobs are going to come from and stuff like that. So I don't think the Conservatives necessarily need to tact because they're at 37%. That's a pretty good base and it seems to be solid. But what they need to do is they need to add another dimension to the messaging related to Donald Trump and the Americans, because that's what Canadians are focused on. So I would hazard to say, if Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives continue on this strategy, they'll have a good election. It'll be hard for them to win because they'll be a one-punch wonder. If they can add another dimension while still talking about the cost of living, then there's a chance that they can close the gap between the Liberals and themselves.
Nik, to your point, we're seeing, strong turnout at his rallies. The messaging is really working for Conservative supporters, but what you're suggesting is he's got the job. He needs a right hook or whatever to really kind of build a bridge over to maybe soft Liberal supporters.
Yeah, and the thing is, we have to remember his support was at 47%. That 10 percentage point advantage, the 10 percentage point delta, are probably people that used to support the Liberals and are probably back with the Liberals right now, which means it is not inconceivable for them to come back to the Conservatives, or for some of those voters to come back and make it a real horse race. But, my point is that, yes, he has to continue and he has a strong base and he'll continue to have people that are highly motivated and believe in his message. It's an excellent base. But if he wants to win, he's got to add something. He doesn't have to take away from what he's doing, but he's got to add something. So let's see if he shifts gears. He's not reversing himself. He shouldn't reverse himself, but can he switch into another gear that keeps the base happy and stays focused on his message related to affordability, but then starts to play in the realm of looking like a prime minister, and as someone who's looking like a prime minister and is a prime minister in waiting, how he would deal with Donald Trump and the Americans.
Nik, Liberal leader Mark Carney had his own campaign issue. There was a candidate who's since withdrawn in Ontario who said some very controversial things in a Chinese language media event about a Conservative candidate who was a pro-democracy activist. It was, very upsetting to pro-democracy advocates in Hong Kong. Carney was asked about, whether he would stand by this candidate repeatedly. And I'll just play you a back and forth with CTV News' Judy Tren.
I'd like to press you a little bit more on Paul Cheng. He lives in a riding that is 70% diverse, people of color. Half of that are people from of Chinese ethnic origin, and of that population, about 20% are from mainland China. The question that people from Hong Kong have asked me to ask is whether or not you are putting appeal to those voters who may support the policies of China ahead of the democratic rights and safety of dissidents who have called Canada home, and mainly Hong Kong democracy activists who now live in Mr. Chang's riding?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Stand foursquare for rights, foursquare for our position, our very strong position vis-a-vis China, respect for Canadian citizens, all rights of Canadian citizens, irrespective of whether they hold dual citizenship or not, to be absolutely clear. And Mr. Chang has long history of service to that community, history of protecting those rights. Mr. Chang is well aware of these issues, including having family in Hong Kong.
How can he be an effective representative for them when they no longer trust him after he said this? The question, as you know, Mr. Carney, you know that Canada has executed 4 Canadians this year.
China.
You know that there are human rights activists in China in detention right now. How can Mr. Chang, how can your party keep him as a candidate knowing this context?
Mr. Chang has apologized for his comments. It's a lapse of judgment. He's apologized for his comments. He's apologized directly to me. He's apologized directly to the individual. He has a long record of service. He's going to continue his candidacy.
So, Nik, that was Liberal leader Mark Carney defending Paul Chang, who within hours of that withdrew his candidacy.
Yeah, you know, Michael, I think it's pretty clear. One of the things that party leaders hate is defending stupid things their candidates do or say, and this is probably a prime example of something that sounds like a no-brainer. Like you have a candidate that says something like this Liberal candidate said, former MP or elected member of Parliament, and for average Canadians just wondering what's up with this. So, you know, I guess the good news for Mark Carney is that the individual in question stepped down, saved Mark Carney from having to clean things up. But you know, I think it was a distraction. You know, when things like this happen, it's a distraction for for Mark Carney and the Liberal Party to deal with that as opposed to dealing with other issues. So I'm sure I wasn't at the conference. I wasn't at the press conference, but I'm sure Judy with her questions that were very pointed and direct. Probably made Mr. Carney a little testy because he was probably unhappy that he had to defend this particular candidate, and then at the same time unhappy that he'd even wanted to talk about it.
What do you make of it? I don't want to characterize it as stubbornness or anything like that, but he was firm in his response, and again, he had been asked, repeatedly at that news conference about this former candidate. Do you think he took the right strategy here as a leader?
Well, you know, the thing is the default position for any campaign is to be on the defensive and to defend. I think it probably would have been you were trying to, hindsight's 2020, but we don't know how long Mark Carney might have known about this or how much he did know about this particular situation. But the thing is that anybody in the Liberal war room should have seen this and thought, we need a response and we don't want to put our leader at risk. At the very least, Mark Carney said, I'm gonna look into this immediately and I'm gonna get back to you tomorrow. For him to show that he's taken a personal interest in an issue like this, and he wanted to get to the bottom of what was actually said and done for him to render a decision. Because you know what, it is within his purview to sign or not sign the nomination papers for any candidate for the Liberal Party of Canada.
Nik, I want to move on to some campaign issues and how Canadians feel about them. You've done some surveys for us. One is about Pierre Poilievre's security clearance, a question that has been, asked many times. What did Canadians feel?
This has been dogging Pierre Poilievre for a while, and especially Mark Carney likes to poke. It's kind of like why don't we call it the automatic Mark Carney conservative, liberal cheap shot at the Conservatives. It's like whenever Poilievre gets a little steam, there's usually some kind of throwaway tagline like, yeah, this is from the guy that doesn't even want to go for a security clearance to learn about foreign interference. In a survey that we've just done and released with CTV News and the Globe and Mail, we asked Canadians how they felt about this issue, whether they supported or opposed Poilievre obtaining a security clearance to know more about potential or possible or threatened foreign interference. And what we saw, at least in the survey, that it's more than 6 out of every 10 Canadians favored Poilievre obtaining the security clearance on this and doing it, and moving forward on that. The reality is that whoever the Prime Minister ends up being, whether it's Poilievre or Mark Carney, they would get a security clearance anyways. So I think for Canadians, they'd just like to see this move forward. But you know what? Pierre Poilievre's got this to deal with. And I think, Michael, we're going to talk about Mark Carney's conundrum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Liberal leader Mark Carney, he's a wealthy guy, I think we can say. He's got a lot of investments. And you also survey Canadians on how they feel about whether he should disclose his assets, which are now in a blind trust, I should add.
Yeah, because we are even-handed at Nanos and CTV News, we ask these questions about both of the leaders, not just one. And for Mark Carney, why don't we call it the dilemma? The Carney dilemma was disclosing details of his blind trust. And we asked Canadians whether they supported or opposed that in the same way that we asked Canadians whether they supported or opposed Pierre Poilievre obtaining a security clearance. And similar numbers. Michael, more than 6 out of every 10, I think about 63% of Canadians actually outright supported or somewhat supported Mark Carney disclosing details of his blind trust. Maybe the key takeaway on the security clearance and the blind trust, there's a certain level of transparency that Canadians expect. It doesn't mean that they need to, for these politicians, Pierre Poilievre does not need to get a security clearance. Mark Carney does not need to disclose the details of his blind trust, but it's pretty clear that 6 out of every 10 Canadians would like to see both of those things happen. And I think a lot of it has to do with transparency. And I think for both of those individuals, they have to realize by not doing these things, it's just something that will dog them over and over again. And they have to worry about either one of these things being a distraction from the key message, where people are wondering what's up with Pierre Poilievre and not getting his security clearance, or what's up with Mark Carney not disclosing his assets. So they have to, both of those individuals have to think of this as a distraction that could dog them and continue to dog them. And here's a question: what happens if one of them decides to do this? Then the other one's going to be on the defensive. So it'll be interesting to see. Maybe both of them will do nothing, or maybe both of them will do something, or who knows what.
Nick, arguably the biggest issue of this election campaign is Donald Trump and his tariffs. You've also done a survey on how Canadians feel about that. What did you find out?
Well, we know April 2 is, what is it?
Liberation Day.
In quotation marks, Liberation Day, because obviously America is not the land of the free. It needs a Liberation Day in addition to Independence Day. That's the day when people will be finding out if, when, what, and how tariffs might work in terms of what Donald Trump and the Trump administration will assert. What's interesting in a survey that we've just completed with CTV News and the Globe and Mail, we talked about a number of things, including potential responses to tariffs from the United States. Interestingly, 3 out of every 4 Canadians would support or somewhat support tariffs on the export of oil, gas, and electricity to the United States. 3 out of every 4 Canadians would also support tariffs, retaliatory tariffs on potash and critical minerals. So it's pretty clear that there's political license, at least right now, for Canada to respond. Not saying that Canadians like the fact that we put tariffs on, not saying that Canadians believe that we would survive or that there wouldn't be damage as a result of a tariff war, but there's license. The other thing is on the jet front. We tested on the F-35 fighter jet. About 6 out of every 10 Canadians would be okay with canceling the F-35, which is a US-made jet, and buying a Eurojet instead. So all this to say, there's license for Canada's leaders to respond firmly to Donald Trump if needed. But I think for a lot of Canadians, they're probably hoping that we don't have to do this, but who knows what will happen. Whatever does happen, it'll be in response to whatever Donald Trump initiates.
Nik, there has been some, regional disparity, I suppose, and thoughts about how Canada should respond. I know Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, as has been very strongly in support of her own province and energy exports. How united do you think Canadians are when you look at this survey?
Well, nationally, when it comes to a Canadian tariff on the export of oil, gas, and electricity, the numbers are around 77% support and somewhat support. In the Prairies, I think the number's around 67%. So maybe the key takeaway, 2 out of every 3 individuals in the Prairies are okay with tariffs on oil and gas. That said, although it was a minority opinion, a pretty significant chunk of voters in the West, like in the Prairies, were opposed. It was about, I think, 25 or between 25 and 30%. So, the thing is in the energy-rich heartland of Canada, a majority of people, not as strong as Canadians in other parts of the country, a majority of residents in the energy heartland are still okay with a tariff on the export of oil, gas, and electricity to the United States in response to what the U.S. does.
Nik, I think that's it for this episode. As always, thanks very much.
Okay, bye-bye.